Hi, and welcome to another WLRN live stream. I'm Thistle Pedersen, your host today for a live discussion with author Aurora Linnea. She just published this book, Man Against Being, Body Horror and the Death of Life, with Spinifex Press. And she's here today in the studio with us. And so is Margaret and Mary from the WLRN team. But before we get to, oh, hi, Mary. Before we get to the discussion, I wanted to welcome you, the live audience, and also say that Mary is going to be moderating the chat today. And you can put your questions for Aurora in the chat. We're going to be taking the questions at the end of the show. And also, I wanted to welcome the audience that's going to watch this after it's recorded, because it will be available on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and our Instagram page. So I hope the insights and wonders of discussing Aurora's book engage all of us into a new way of being that ends male dominion, as Aurora puts it, and brings forward our powers of regeneration as a class, as women, as a whole, and as our individual selves. That interplay between the one and the many, and the permeability and vulnerability of our shared soft bodies, is what enraptured me into not just reading, but drinking in Aurora's exquisite work that is both rich in form and content. I read a passage from the book to a stranger when I was at a coffee shop enjoying the read, and she immediately said, "Is that poetry?" Because indeed, Aurora's prose reads like poetry and moves us to stillness and to action thus. It's a wonderful read and so timely. My hope is that our show today gives you, the audience, the taste you need to run, not walk, to your local library and request this book be on the shelf for all. And then buy your own copy from our sisters at Spinifex Press and start a book club in your area. That's how impactful and exciting this book is for our women's movement 2025 and into the future. Happy New Year, sisters. It's so good to be here in the best company the internet can muster. Let's use our luster for the Yoniverse to jump through these blue screens and have a true meeting of the minds that changes us forward, as we say here in Wisconsin. So now, let me introduce you to Margaret, WLRN's graphic designer who got and read the book and will be asking and engaging with Aurora later on in the program. Margaret is an artist, designer, radical ecofeminist, and grandmother. Recognizing that women's history and contributions have been largely overlooked, she seeks out art, music, literature, and philosophy by women. She herself enjoys creating with many types of media, including limestone, pixels, paint, fabric, sound, and dirt. After working as a designer and illustrator and getting a master's of fine arts, she taught drawing, design, and art history at several colleges and universities. Working with the earth, she replaced acres of grass with wildflowers and has planted hundreds of trees. For fun, she likes to kayak at the edge of the wilderness. Welcome, Margaret. Can you say a few words about your reading of the book before we introduce Aurora?
Sure. Thanks, Thistle. I appreciate Aurora for exploring these issues in her book, Man Against Being, that our culture overlooks. How it is normal to demonize nature and women along with it. How so much of Plato's writings, which are foundational to Western culture, are so dismissive of women. The idea that men are closer to the divine because they are supposedly less close to nature. Most of philosophy is based on justifying men's superiority over women and life itself. There's such a disconnect from reality. These have been concerns of mine for some time, as they affect both how women are treated and how life on Earth suffers generally when people do not appreciate life and are afraid of the fact of our own mortality. So it's good to be here with my WLRN sisters. Take it away, Thistle.
All right, so apparently we're having some issues with getting onto Instagram. Sorry about that. Next time. So we'll be on the YouTube channel and we'll be on our Facebook page. So thank you, Margaret. I'm so glad that you're here. And I'm also super excited to have here in the virtual WLRN studios with us, Aurora Linnea. She is the author of Man Against Being, Body Horror and the Death of Life, and she'll be talking with us today about that book. Welcome, Aurora.
Hi, Thistle. Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right, well, let's start with your childhood before we dive into the book. What was it like? When did you start writing and know that you loved it? What was your parents' philosophy of parenting? In your acknowledgement section, you write, I thank my parents for raising me to be a feral creature and for showing me true nonconformity, unquote. Please tell us more about how you grew up and how it shaped your worldview and the writing of the book.
Sure. So I think sort of the most formative thing about my childhood that's relevant here is that both my parents are veterinarians. So I grew up constantly surrounded by, and in fact more sort of socialized with non-human rather than human animals. We always had dogs, cats, birds, rabbits. I had chinchillas. There were mice. I rode horses. My mom was in veterinary school during the time that I was in elementary school, and I spent a lot of time there with her and with animals. And then my dad, actually, the other thing that's really, when I was with my mom at the veterinary school, she'd take me to lectures with her and things like gross pathology labs, gross as in big, not yucky. And I would like watch people dissect and look at horse livers full of worms and things like this. So I saw a lot of the body in a very visceral and clear way growing up. My dad also had his own veterinary practice in New Hampshire, and I spent a lot of time in the summers that I spent there tagging along on farm calls with him and helping hold down pigs and goats and sheep so that they could get their vaccinations and catching baby goats and farms and things like this. And so I really grew up very, very aware of animals and bodies and the realities of being an animal body and all of the vulnerabilities that go along with that, as well as the reality of death. These were all very palpable and present in my childhood. As far as my parents' parenting philosophy, I'll say that both of my parents are really intelligent, but also idiosyncratic and iconoclastic people. My mom was a punk who loved science and then put herself through vet school and was always a fiercely independent single mom. And my dad is sort of an aspiring wilderness hermit. And so he taught me a lot about the wilderness, and was definitely more geared towards that than human society. So those were really important grounding and developing things in my childhood that led me to the strange place I am now.
Oh, it's a wonderful place. It's a place that's alive with poetry and nature and, the stuff of life. It's been such a joy to read your writing, Aurora. So how did you come up with the title? It's a very provocative title. Like, I was out, reading and had it on the table, and somebody was like, what? It kind of turns your head. So how did you come up with that title?
Sure. I really like titles. Often I have titles lined up for works well ahead of even really outlining the piece. Especially with poetry projects, that's almost always the case. But with regards to this book, I had the book outlined in my mind for quite a while under several different titles before I came to Man Against Being. And in fact, before I was working with Spinifex, my title was Men Against Being, but I think the tweak to make it singular is an improvement. Before I had Man Against Being, I knew I wanted to do body horror and the death of life because I really liked the starkness of the juxtaposition of death and life there. As you said, I felt that it was provocative, even the insinuation that life itself could be killed or was the target here. Because I also wanted to be quite direct and straight to the point, in that you could say that patriarchy enacts violence against all sorts of different groups, as it certainly does. But that is the larger scale thing, the sort of overarching thing is this rejection of and violence towards life itself. It's actually a deep antagonism towards living that drives all these other forms of violence.
Necrophilia.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And so I wanted that to be really upfront in the title. And from that is where I came to Man Against Being, because I was trying to figure out, like, what is it exactly that man is posed against ultimately, and it's creation, it's being, it's life.
But yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, but he also has an instinct, because he is an animal, as you point out. Mm-hmm. As much as he doesn't want to be, he is. I mean, doesn't he have an instinct, like every living creature, to live? So. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, certainly, I think that's an important distinction to make too. Is that individual men are animals, are humans, right? Obviously, but the sort of conglomerate that is the system, which is what I am referring to when I say man, that is bigger than individual men, and individual men become agents of this larger man. And that man, I think, does not have a strong life instinct.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to my next question, because I think a lot of people, you yourself talk in the beginning about how grim the book is. It's difficult. It's difficult to read. I had emotional responses as I was reading your book. It's painful in parts because the perversion of man that you so solidly researched and gave examples of, example after example. I think Lear Keith was like page after pounding page, But those painful pages also brought with them an incredible hope in realizing that we are hardwired mammals that wish to live and have a communion with nature and life. So let me give you an example of your writing on page 243, and also the listener, please hear this. It's beautiful. Aurora says on page 243 in the last chapter about what is to be done to resolve man's deadly madness, you state, quote, "Desensitized indifference and disdain for softness are unnatural to the animals we are, distortions of our native grace, the care of others inbred in our inheritance from the living world, defined as it is by nurturant and symbiotic interconnectedness. Empathy is nature's law of succor, manifest in the earthly organisms we are, experienced inwardly as an urge to exist in compassionate relation with others, end quote. So much of unlocking our healing regenerative powers lie in resensitizing ourselves to our bodies and what's materially real, and feeling the pain, but also to see how our soft and vulnerable bodies are connected and how we're all in this together, and that we can even rejoice in that oneness. Can you talk about the pain of the book, but also the joy of it?
Yeah, thank you for that summary of the sort of coexistence of pain and despair and the joy and aliveness that I'm trying to communicate, and which I understand as being as necessarily accompanying being aware and attentive to the living world, and what man has done and continues to do to it. It is horrible to bear witness to the harms and the degradations and the desecrations and atrocities that man-made civilization perpetrates daily. It's overwhelming and almost unthinkable, the extremity and seeming endlessness of male violence. Right now, as we're speaking, there's a genocide. There are men at war. Men are perpetrating war in the Ukraine and Sudan. There's deforestation and the killing of the oceans that continues apace. How many women are being prostituted today? How many women murdered by how many women will be murdered by male partners by the time we reach tonight? How many will be beaten? How many girl children will be sexually abused today? There are mines. There are men raising foxes and groundhogs and birds' homes to build suburban sprawl McMansions that only rich white men can afford. And I just read the other day that the Humane Society estimates that 1 million animals are hit by cars each day and killed. Meanwhile, there's all of the animals in the industrial farm system living in really tortured conditions in confinement facilities. And this is today, and that will still be the way it is tomorrow. And it goes on and on. All of this is happening. All of this pain is being inflicted within men's systems, the systems that structure our own lives. And it's almost more suffering than can really be imagined, much less contemplated or sat with or absorbed. And yet, the alternative to taking in this pain is the dull, anesthetized, and alienated, careless, selfish numbness that is the callousness that really defines male dominion's whole sort of psychic and emotional ethos. I'm in pain in this world because others are in pain, because beings are being harmed. And I'm glad that I am capable of being in pain in that way, because it means that I'm alive and I haven't been deadened by the system in which I exist. And so I think it's really important to face suffering and to be willing to suffer in a suffering world, and never to close down to it, but rather to celebrate the capacity for feeling and for empathizing with other creatures that is so natural to the miracle of being alive. Because being alive really is such a miracle when you think of all the conditions that had to come into place perfectly for life to even come into existence on Earth. And we should revere that and not squander it by making living such a painful ordeal for so many. So pain and joy are not dichotomous or mutually exclusive in any way. So it's maybe better to say that if our joy can only exist if pain is excluded or ignored, that joy is ultimately a tepid and cowardly thing. Loving life means being willing to be hurt.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for that, Aurora. And we've got Margaret now. She's going to ask.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. that was just awesome to hear about your childhood and to know how really it, you can kind of understand a little bit better how you can accept the pain that you're talking about when you kind of grew up with death and animals, in such a hands-on manner and all. That's just awesome. So in your book, I was especially interested in your description of somatophobia and how feminists are, noticing how that feminists have talked about this for a while, the issue of body hatred and all that. And you mentioned that Elizabeth V. Spellman invented the word somatophobia. And so I went and I found her article, Women as Body, Ancient and Contemporary Views from 1982. And I also have Mary Daly's Gyne Ecology book. So I was looking at that and noticing some of what she was discussing back in 1978, which was when I was in college, by the way. But it was interesting to review the fact that feminists have been discussing, like how Plato and society embraced body hatred and this idea that males have souls, and as if women don't. Anyway, feminists have been kind of looking into that for at least 50 years. And I'm also keenly aware of the fact that some feminists really hate the idea of women being more connected to nature and life itself than men, although I like to feel like I'm connected to life and nature. So yeah, and so that's part of why I appreciate your book. I really kind of feel like as long as people continue to think that men are closer or more like God than women, and that women's connection to life makes us somehow bad, this will always be a problem. I think it's important to our planet, like you say, and all the things that kind of industrialized society is doing. But I hope that people can get to recognizing the human impact, especially industrialized type humans, and appreciate life and all that. So anyway, it's great to have more books that address all this. The more the better, and I'm happy to see your book as part of this discussion. Would you like to comment on the feminist history as it relates to your book?
Sure, yeah. I think you make great points. Feminists and ecofeminists in particular have indeed been arguing against patriarchal, I say it's somatophobia. It's definitely a mouthful, so I don't know. I've never heard anyone other than me really say it. So the women have been arguing against patriarchal somatophobia and its discontents for decades, 50 years, as you mentioned. And yet somehow this criticism has not really managed to enter in as a standard tenet of the feminist, or even really the radical feminist analysis of man-made civilization and its harms and various systems of harm. So it's common enough for feminists to complain of men viewing or treating women as just bodies in, say, prostitution or pornography, and not as people. But what does this opposition really mean? That bodies are not people and people are not bodies? The fundamental dualistic conceptualization remains unchecked here. Women say they want to be more than just their bodies. But what is wrong with being a body? How did this become a bad thing? These are the questions which I really was seeking, for which I was really seeking answers in my research, because I think they get at the most sort of basic fractures and alienations and antagonisms of the world that men have made. They're ideological questions. Another thing that feminists will argue, especially in more liberal feminist realms, is that women come to hate their bodies because of objectification and unrealistic, quote unquote, unrealistic beauty standards. So the remedy is this business of sort of body acceptance, or what's known as body positivity, which mostly comes down to a matter of convincing oneself that one is sexy, no matter what, no matter your shape or size. Like if you're not a size 2, 6 foot tall blonde with fake breasts and Instagram face, you too can be sexy. That's body positivity, unfortunately. And this is what liberal women generally thought that I was writing about when I would briefly and sort of semi-obliquely describe my book to them. And I wouldn't usually try to clarify. But viewing your body as an object to sexualize and flaunt, regardless of your proximity to admittedly grotesque beauty standards, is still in line with dualism. There's still this disjunction of the body and the I, the self. So despite feminist analyses of somatophobia and mind-body dualism being not really new at all, I think we have to just keep at it, keep saying these same things, because clearly the point hasn't sunk in. And Plato and these other, even Descartes, really, they're still revered and still taken seriously as the sort of fathers of wisdom and knowledge and philosophy in our society. So you have to keep chipping away at and undermining the reverence for them in order to move those ideologies out of their rootedness.
Yeah, absolutely. It is just incredible when you think about how entrenched they are. And I'm not sure how it is with kids going up through school, now, but when I was growing up, like Plato was close to God, and all that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, certainly in his opinion.
Yeah. One thing I wondered is if you put yourself, kind of put people in the place closer to animals, like if we were bonobos, of course, then there's the bonobos and there's the chimps. And when, I don't know, it's kind of weird sometimes when you look at how those animals interact, it's just kind of interesting when you think about some of the things that men do, and and women do.
For sure. And there are so many different social formations in the animal world too. And the thing about human culture is that we're conscious of it and we can actively transform it as well, which is a bit different. I don't know, maybe cultural transformation is more possible than we think it is in non-human animals, but we certainly have the capacity to choose and to change our cultures. So we can have all sorts of social formations. Yeah.
Well, right. And it's so funny when you think about, like, if people, it seems like the point of Plato and men is that they want to think that they're so analytic and so smart. And yet if they're so smart, why aren't they figuring out how to live better with the earth, more communally and all that? It's a weird thing, really, when you think about all that. But let's see, I think Thistle's got some more questions.
So hi again. So you use religious words to describe your ideas about the regenerative and reintegrating powers of nature found within ourselves and outside of ourselves that will help end male dominion. Yet in your book, you are clearly against male religion, and you even question the value of myths themselves, calling them human artifice that have us experiencing reality through our own inventions rather than directly experiencing the world. Yet you use terms like holy and hallowed and magical to describe the powers of nature, the birthright of every living creature. Can you talk about the difference between religion and spirituality? Is it possible to preserve some aspects of religion and myth, such as group singing, poetry, and rituals that may use religious terms and imagery without falling into the snarls of patriarchal myths that harm? Please discuss your use of religious terms, especially in your last chapter titled Resurrectionary Feminism, and how you delink those terms from patriarchal religion and myth and instead link them to what you consider sacred. What is it that makes something sacred, and how does your concept of the sacred differ from patriarchal religions?
Yeah. For me, there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll do my best. For me, the major salient difference between my sort of what I would call mystic materialist understanding and a classic patriarchal religious understanding is that for me, life is what is sacred. It's an organism's aliveness or some form of matter's location in the living world that consecrates it, and which therefore demands reverence. In patriarchal religious conceptualizations, sacredness is acquired through external influence. Something becomes sacred when it is touched by the hand of God, or sacredness is derived from proximity to God in whatever way. And that God or gods is beyond life, beyond the earth, and separate from matter. It's God's position outside of mortal material reality that makes him such a comfort, and the ambition in worshiping this kind of otherworldly, immortal deity is to one day become more like him, to be saved, and saved from what? From life, from death. God and his sacred, in men's imaginings, is transcendent. He is that which exists without, outside of the world. The sacred, as I conceive of it, is immanent, it's within, and it's a property of earthliness, inseparable from bodies and from ecosystems. Because as far as we know, there is no life elsewhere, which is really makes life itself really miraculous and incredible. When I write of life as sacred, I also mean that we have to honor it, which means honoring the vulnerability of living beings and landscapes to injury, to harm. And this is a reverence that we act on through gentleness to other creatures. Religious men historically have not seen living beings as sacred at all, or only sacred in the sense that they have been granted by the divinity as gifts from the Father God to his chosen sons, to be used for man's purposes. So in my view, to instrumentalize another being as existing only for one's purposes rather than for its own is desecration. But men haven't believed this. There's little in their religious ideologies to give them this notion that you shouldn't harm or exploit another. The result of viewing an abstract and immaterial God removed from earthly reality as sacred and living material creatures as less than sacred and even lowly has been violence and exploitation for millennia of all kinds, as well as ecocide. As far as the difference between the religious and the spiritual, I think that's a subtler thing to sort of pick apart, and I don't know that I'm the best person to do that. I'm not exactly spiritual, and I tend to approach spirituality with some caution, because again, what is the spirit? As sort of a rigorously anti-dualist person and thinker, I'm disinclined to give the spirit much play in my own thinking. But as far as ritual and ceremony and these things go, I feel like they're incredibly useful cultural practices as a means of solidifying one's commitment to one's values and one's connection and devotion to the world of which one is a part or in which one is located, and all of its mystery. And myth, too. I think myth has great cultural power, but it is cultural. When I say it's artifice, that's not a value-loaded description. It's objective. We make up stories. These are stories. They're fictions. They're artifice. They're invented. They are therefore mediations between us and reality as it stands. And I think we have to be at least willing to come into a direct, unmediated relationship with the world, to come down to ourselves and the shared material reality of humans, other creatures, plants, the dirt, these things. For me, my own sort of practice is I like to go to the woods and I greet chipmunks as friends, and I get really excited about all of the different colors that moss can be and how amazing it is that trees grow. I think about cells, about mitochondria, when I want to connect to the sacred, and that there's ecstasy in that for me. Yeah.
That was a great answer. Thank you. Because I belong to the Reformed Congregation of the Goddess International, and there's so many scholars that are a part of that organization, but yet it is a religion. And, there's a lot to be said for studying religion and participating in it, because it uplifts you. It can connect you. But as long as, like you're saying, you realize this is a creation, and this is not exactly like walking into the woods and having a direct experience of nature. But I know that when I am dancing and singing with other women in ritual, and it can be outside, you can hear the woods singing and you sing back, and so I feel like those group rituals and ceremonies can that's our birthright, that's part of nature, that people have done that forever and ever. We've danced and we've sung, maybe not forever and ever. I see you looking a little skeptical. But I do think, language has been around for a really long time in our species, the verbal language, and that there is an exchange that happens with our words and nature that, for me, can, in a group especially, can bring about a deeper connection and a feeling of community and love for life. So thank you for that answer. And I've got another question, and I know we've got some questions in the studio, but we're going to take those a little bit later on. Thank you so much to our live audience for being here. It's great to see your comments. This is a WLRN live stream. I'm your host, Thistle, and our guest today is Aurora. She's the author of this book that just came out called Man Against Being, Body Horror and the Death of Life. And it was published by Spinifex Press. So you can head on over to Spinifex Press. Mary, maybe if you wanted to put in the comments a link to where Aurora's book can be found on the Spinifex website, that would be fantastic. And so now I'm going to just move on to my other question, because, and it's going to be meaty like that last one. But that's how Aurora's book is. It's a very dense text. There's multiple layers to it. Lots of, if you really love poetry and reading and writing, you're going to love this book. So in looking at some of the key terms you discuss in the last chapter of your book, resurrectionary feminism, which, wow, what a title. I created the following question to try to distill some concepts and ideas from your writing that you could talk about today. You say this on page 247, Quote, militant compassion at its fiercest spurs us to raise the architecture of devastation, to claw our way down to cultural sadism's provenance so that we may at last uproot it, to siphon the poison from the soil in order that something less rancid can grow up in its place of the deathly travesty man's spewed seed has sown. Unquote. What is radical empathy and how is it related to militant compassion and in the shaping of our morality that you talk about when it comes to the task of ending male dominion?
Yeah. So I think to answer this question, I would do best just to read a bit of what I've written rather than sort of paraphrase and probably complicate rather than clarify. So in the book, I call radical empathy our native grace, natural to us and emanating from our condition as vulnerable bodies. On page 242, let me find it. So I write, no body is indifferent to her own extermination. I wrote, no body does not care if she is hurt. No body is indifferent to his own extermination. You need to eat, and so do I. You need rest, as I do. Such straightforward realizations, rooted in our shared carnality, form the basis for empathy. With my own body, I can feel into yours, and what hurts you is painful to me, because I too have been hurt, because I do not desire to suffer. It is obvious to me that you wouldn't either. In my own vulnerable body, viscerally, I am aware of your vulnerabilities and attentive to them. How little it matters that yours are not identical to my own. It is enough that both of us can be wounded. Both of our lives could be snuffed out in an instant. Fragile as we both are, how could we let one another suffer? How could I ever mean you any harm, you who are my flesh and blood, and how could I massacre this earth, the larger body that incorporates us both, sensing its substance as our own? It's this recognition of shared vulnerability and the care for other creatures that it evokes that forms the basis of an equally naturally emergent morality, what I call instinctual morality, the preeminent principle of which is do no harm. To hurt another or to stand by as another creature is hurt is unthinkable within this moral framework. In the book I write, if I can feel you as I feel myself, and if we are real to one another, then when you are in agony, I am, and I cannot bear it. Soon your suffering will move me to act. That care and that attention to another being, which motivates action unstoppably, is militant compassion. Compassion can be sort of a floppy and listless concept in popular usage, kind of a treacle niceness that might recognize harms and maybe shed a tear and sniffle and send a check to something once a year. Militant compassion, by contrast, takes love for the living world seriously and acts on it every day as praxis. Also, militant compassion is grounded in an analysis, and it's explicitly political, concerned with systems of power, rather than being diffuse and drawn from sort of specific scenario to specific scenario, and easily distracted in this way, which I think that compassion can be in its more sort of mainstream sense, and certainly in the way that it is imposed on women as a feminine value and integral to servile femininity. Militant compassion is not being sweet to everyone. It is caring deeply enough to take hard stands in service of others who are being harmed.
Yeah. And also there's an urgency to the word militant for me, and there's an urgency in your book and in that last chapter. It's time, the time is now for us to come together and feel our material bodies, but it's so painful. You know, I'm just thinking about the fires in Los Angeles and realizing the situation that we're in. There's a lot of incentive to just escape and watch Netflix, you know?
Yeah.
So what's the incentive, Aurora? Why should we feel this pain and get in touch with our empathy and get into, you know, have this process happen?
Yeah. I mean, I hope I touched on that in the answer.
About the joy.
About pain and joy.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I think to exist in complacency and callousness and to surrender to that is to become complicit with the system that is wrecking these harms. And that kind of complicity, I personally can't stand in myself. Like, that to me is far, far more painful than the pain of looking at reality, at what's being done, and being willing to strive in some way. It's the alternative is living death and concession and being drawn into a murderous system. And I think certainly as feminists, how can we do that? How can we let ourselves fall into that? Yeah. But the other thing is that, you know, if we're just binge watching Netflix, that is also, it's just such an unvital state of being. And there still is, for all of the harms that are being perpetrated, for all of the destruction that we can see all around us, there is beauty and real vital joy still in this world. The world is good, you know? And we have access to that experience, and that is so much deeper and more profound and more loving and fulfilling than
binge watching Netflix is. Right. No, and I also like in your book how we don't need a mediator. We don't need a Mother Mary to mediate between us and nature or God. Or, you know, I'm using God here, but we can directly experience it at any time. We can come to the present moment and experience and appreciate and find some beauty in the present moment. And that coming back into that place of connection is really what's going to motivate us to feel the empathy and the care, to hopefully, I mean, it's just so painful, Aurora. I mean, I know you know what I mean? Like, I don't feel like we're avoiding the pain sometimes if we do just succumb. You know, these states that you're talking about, I go in and out of them. There are times when I will binge on Netflix, and other times where I'm a wondrous creature in the woods communing with the moss and all of nature, you know, and that's me, the same person. And so I feel like, especially in this society with all of like the temptations and the computers and the digitized nature of how we're living, it's really hard to escape from, you know?
Yeah, of course. And it's meant to be, you know, like,
yeah, that's the sinister aspect of it. The sinister aspect of it that our friend Jennifer Billick really gets into in her book. So let's see, where are we in the script? I'm sorry. I think, Margaret, you've got something else you would like to ask Aurora.
Yeah, just had a couple things. I've been appreciating the conversation. It's been great. Kind of along the lines of what you were just talking about, Thistle and Aurora, was like, what can we do to connect, or, you know, and just to get in the mindset. And so some of the things you had already mentioned in your book include accepting we are our bodies, that this is, you know, instead of thinking we're something else and putting that out there, learning from nature, kind of, and understanding that we're part of an ecosystem, but also just learning things from other animals, or learning, just about life from the whole system. And then another one was, and I love this too, like mindfulness regarding ourselves as multitudinous beings. Like, I think we might have more bacteria than human cells, and that it is kind of a freaky thing when you think about it. Here's me and my body, but not only is it me living, it's like all these other things are living too. And they're all a part of us, and they're presumably enjoying their life, hopefully, as much as,
Yeah.
as much as bacteria or whatever,
It is a symbiotic relationship after all.
Yeah, it really is. It's really interesting. Did you want to talk about any of that, or other things people might try to do to connect?
Yeah, sure. So the term for this understanding of the organism as an assemblage of host and other species, the multitudinous being, that's holobiont, and I love that term. So I do think, like, coming into reconfiguring the idea of the self as this assemblage is really, really important for getting over the kind of severance and isolation that defines the patriarchal concept of the self. This kind of, it's the closed man is the concept, where the subject is isolated and impenetrable and cleanly separated from creation by the hard shell of the body, as if the body were this, like, the ideal body in the patriarchal sense is like a machine that you live within, that the soul resides within. And the holobiont concept, and just looking at our place within the natural world and at the other life forms more generally, it works towards a more biologically informed and realist sense of oneself as an organism in perpetual interchange within and without with other beings and the ecosystem. And that's really integral to shaking off mind-body dualism and horror of horror of permeability with the world. I also,
it is like accepting that we're part of this world, and we're not just they want to just have us set our minds somehow floating above the world, and we're not really living in the world, but we are.
Right. And that's like part of the great sort of patriarchal futurist dream, is just pure mind floating in space, right? Like completely dissevered from earthly existence completely.
Well,
but
then
go ahead.
I was just going to say how it's interesting that we, the scientists of our time, like, more every day, it seems like, that we learn about, whether it's DNA or genomes, or the bacteria, but it's kind of, it feels like it's really different from, like, me when I was young, our understanding, which was more that separate being. So part of it, it seems like to me might be helping, is just the knowledge that we're getting from science these days.
For sure. Yeah, there's so much fascinating research. But I do also want to say another really necessary part of moving towards acceptance of the body and undoing somatophobia, and which is the really hard thing, is accepting mortality. So somatophobia's root cause is the fear of death, which is viewed as an affront and a loss of control. And also, it's scary. It's the unknown, in a very basic way. But men have understood their mortality in terms of nature's murderousness and held their bodies in contempt for dying. So now that we have, the result of that is a culture that is fixated on technological routes out of death. Modern heroic medicine still does figure death as its enemy, although things like the hospice movement have worked to shake that up a bit. There is no living without dying, and there shouldn't be. For one creature to die is nourishment for the earth. and an origin point for new lives. And I do just think that coming into a more open and less fear-based orientation around death is fundamental to transforming our relationship with the animals that we are and the world that we are a part of.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in your book too, like funeral practices. I have a goddess-loving friend who passed away about several years ago, and was buried in like just a cloth bag, maybe, instead of the whole casket and all the chemicals, too, that people get all preserved with, sort of.
It's disgusting.
It is. Yeah, it's a weird thing. Let's see. Besides that, I was interested in like if you have any particular poets or musicians that kind of you feel are maybe people that might feel more connected to this concept like what we're talking about.
Specifically to the concept of somatophobia, or sort of
more
I'm generally
thinking like people that you have more of a sense that they understand our connection to life and the earth, and maybe getting away from the somatophobia.
Yeah, sure. So I would really recommend everyone check out just the sort of ecofeminist archives. Women have been writing on these issues since the 70s. Susan Griffin, I would recommend all of her work. Yes, and then there's also like Marty Keel is great, Val Plumwood, Paula Gunn Allen, Vandana Shiva, Jane Caputi is another. I really feel like the ecofeminists are underread and should be brought back into circulation more. There's also this really wonderful book called My Name is Chellis and I'm in Recovery from Western Civilization by Chellis Glendinning. And she is, I think she calls herself like an eco-psychologist, but she's very much a feminist as well, and does a lot of other writing about technology and about Western civilization and its psychopathologies and its harms. I also think feminists and women who are writing in the sort of animal liberation space do a really good job of this. There's the classics like Carol Adams and Josephine Donovan and Karen Davis, who passed away recently, but there's also Greta Gard is really amazing, and Patrice Jones, who has a farmed animal sanctuary in Vermont. My friend Sil Coe does really interesting work in this arena around ideas of the human and how these are based in rejections of animality and how that plays into racial oppression. So I think that's another great space to look for. And then I also would throw out Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century medieval mystic, who isn't, I mean, her writings blow me away and are very, in spite of being Catholic and very rooted in that tradition, they're extremely earth-based and expansive in the directions that she was going with things, in a way that you can sort of just tell that her more sort of traditional God investment was a cover for her doing the other things that she wanted to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm pretty familiar with some of her artwork and stuff, but I'll need to read some of that. And I have read some of those ecofeminists, but yeah, it's good to always have more to look for.
Aurora, have you ever seen this book, Reweaving the World? Because a lot of the authors you mentioned are in this book. I got this when I was in graduate school, and it's packed with essays by those ecofeminists that you were mentioning, Charlene Spretnik being another one that you mentioned in the book. And I remember how she was participating in the Green Party and the movement in Germany. And yeah, she's in here. Reweaving the World, Sisters. It's a fantastic anthology of ecofeminism. Also, I wanted to see if you might have heard of this book, Healing Through the Dark Emotions. It's written by a psychotherapist. The wisdom of grief, fear, and despair, as a little encouragement for us to feel our feelings, and that our feelings, even the dark ones, the hard ones, the despair, the anger, the grief, that they're giving us something when we connect to them, that they guide us. And so you haven't, Miriam Greenspan is the author, and she does a wonderful job of encouraging us to get in touch with our feelings, even though, you know, they may be unpleasant. Oh, and we've got a comment here from Lear Keith. It says, lots of medieval women mystics are wonderful. My favorite is Julian of Norwich. Thank you, Lear, for coming today and dropping that comment in the chat. Go ahead, Aurora.
Yeah, one, I love Julian of Norwich, and yes, there are many, many amazing medieval women mystics, and I sort of have secret aspirations of living in an anchor hold, but not a godly one. But I have that book, Reweaving the World, and it's amazing. There are another really good one is called Healing the Wounds, edited by Judith Plant. And that one is highly recommended as well. Yeah, that's there are lots of them. If anyone is interested in a ecofeminist reading list, reach out to me and I'll set you up.
Oh, cool, Aurora. I would love to get that list from you. I actually am going to do a presentation on ecofeminism for our CGI, Reformed Congregation of the Goddess International. So I would love to get a reading list from you. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask Mary to come on and let us know about what has been happening in the chat. Thanks for moderating the chat, Mary. And I hear there are some questions for Aurora there.
Yeah, a lot of good conversation going on in the chat. Excellent discussion, you guys, and Margaret as well. Really interesting. We have a few questions and comments that are kind of related to each other. So Aurora, I might read some comments and then go into the question if that works for you.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So this goes back to one of your earlier comments in the show. Many women encounter radical feminism through feminists like Mary Daly, who is a feminist with Catholic roots. Could you discuss how feminists like Daly, who may be kind of exploring patriarchal religions through a radical feminist lens, have contributed to radical feminism?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
I mean, Mary Daly is obviously incomparable and canonical, and Gynecology is a must-read book. I think it's really helpful for these women who've been steeped in these ideological spaces, who therefore have really learned this stuff, to be able to bring that into a really clear and clarifying analysis of it. And it's one thing for me to go in and analyze this or that religious system, but I'm only ever, I don't have a deep knowledge of it, in that I haven't been a theologian in that space. I haven't inhabited it in that same way. And so there's tremendous value to that kind of immersion and bringing that into critique and analysis.
Great. And Olivia, she shared a post that she found on Tumblr, and it says, My religion is other women. This isn't tongue-in-cheek. My religion congregates around a fire in a cramped room we book to talk in an idling car for way too long in someone's living room in the cold because there's more to say in here. There's a spark of divinity I know to look for when she says something she's never said out loud before. There's a spiritual rumble in the dehydrated voices of women who aren't used to saying so much. When I hear another woman articulate something I've never been able to, that's the voice of my God speaking to me. It's ancient, forbidden knowledge, and it fills my body with myself. There's power in our warm red blood. So the question really is, consciousness raising was a key part of feminist action in the 60s and 70s especially. There's a long history of women meeting, congregating, and imparting knowledge, often for religious purposes and discussions. What do you think motivates and has historically motivated women to engage with each other in this way, especially when it wasn't something that was particularly encouraged by the men in their society?
Sure. I love I love that Tumblr. Is it a meme? Does that constitute a meme? Tumblr post. I mean, I think in part it is because women are kept so isolated from one another that we are also then like driven together, or have been, because it's for women to exist in these spaces where their lives and their purposes and the ways of thinking that they're surrounded by are man-made and men's, and coming from the men. That's so alienating, profoundly alienating, and especially when all of that information that you're living within is so opposed to your freedom and to your fullness, that produces a lack, which drives one towards others seeking what one is being deprived of. And so I think that I also think that women have come together because of shared experience and shared social roles and all of these things. But I do think there's a large part of it that is men's isolation of us from one another has really backfired in a major way.
Great, thank you. We also have a comment from Lisa, who talks about women as the best animal partners. Where men force training on animals, women endeavor to understand animal behaviors in order to shape them for partnering with humans for tasks as well as play. And Christy asked, as Lisa Lane mentions, how does a healthier view of females relate to man's treatment and view of other animals? And Christy, if you have any other follow-up, feel free to put it into the chat.
How does a healthier view of females related to man's treatment and view of other animals? I'm not.
I think that question might be, how does here we go. How does a healthier view of females, I think actually now I'm trying to.
Yeah, sorry.
Christy, are you trying to say perhaps how, if man were to view women in a healthier way, would that translate to their treatment of animals? Would that improve, do you think? Do you think there's a connection between the two, the treatment of women and animals by men?
I think there's a very substantial connection. I think that the pattern is a bit shifted in that I think, and I write about this in the book, that animals really are, non-human animals are the first othered group, and the first sort of excluded from humanity as defined by man in his terms. as ensouled and defined by mind and these things. And animals are left out of that to justify exploitation, largely.
Mhm.
And then women were brought into that realm of exclusion, more the development of animal agriculture, or that's theorized, right? That is a theory that exists. And then women become compared to animals, and these ways of treating animals are imposed on women as well. So I think breaking down these definitions of animality as opposed to humanity, and from that breakdown would open up different ways of treating animals and women, and understanding the differentiation between beings in a broad sense.
Great, thanks. So Christy's also followed up, and she talks about how putting women or the female on a pedestal ends up othering them. So they're more like chattel than humans. Do you have any thoughts regarding that? How it can be perhaps even more, destructive to women as, humans, as animals, placing them on this pedestal so you're not seeing them as they truly are, but as something that you come up with in your head.
Gosh, there's this great quote that I always come back to that's from Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And she says, and I have to paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me, but she says something like, what she wants most to see is a woman who is neither in the prison or on the pedestal, but just a free person walking down the street, right? And so there are both of these things that exist that are oppressive. The prison, the cage, captivity, confinement, and like more brute forms of oppression. But the pedestal is just, it's the carrot kind of aspect of oppression. But women there are still derealized, depersonalized, and ultimately serving the purposes of male dominion as a symbol. And you get that sort of symbolic power, symbolic value as a compensation prize for having no material or political power.
Thank you. We talked a bit about, or you talked with Margaret and with Thistle, about different authors and feminist theorists that really meant a lot to you. When we talk with, just people throughout our daily life who may not be really well versed in feminist scholars, but maybe, taking in media that is more, popular in our culture, is there anything, whether it's a movie, a show, or a book, that you think it may not be perfect, but is on its way towards really what you've been talking about? So something that may touch on the ideas that you've discussed or other ecofeminists or radical feminists have discussed, that may be more, it may be simpler for some people who are not in this sphere, that they could kind of engage with it. And it might be kind of an opening for them to actually read your book and other feminist text.
Oh, goodness. As far as pop culture is concerned, I kind of live under a rock, so I don't know as much about movies or TV shows. Sadly, I'm sorry to say. I'm trying to think of. There are definitely novels in this not like ecofeminist novels that might be more accessible. I'm trying to think. I mean, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland is a not exactly an ecofeminist text, but an interesting sort of alternative culture utopian vision. And Ursula Le Guin has some really great novels that touch on these themes.
I was wondering if you were going to mention her. That's interesting.
Yeah. I always have a hard time with her novels because I get really annoyed by sci-fi conventions. So I'm troubled by them. I have trouble sticking with them. But they do explore these themes, and a lot of people really love them. So I will recommend them there. Similarly, Octavia Butler is another sort of sci-fi writer who explores more earth-sustaining cultural formations. That's what I can throw out now, but there are many. And so this is not a film that will tell you about these things, but there's an amazing documentary. Oh yeah, Starhawk is great. There's an amazing documentary called The Radioactive Wolves of Chernobyl, and it is about the rewilding of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and I talk about it kind of endlessly. It's one of the most encouraging pieces of media I've ever interacted with, and it shows vividly the natural world's capacity for regeneration, even in the face of really extreme man-made destruction. So it's very hopeful for me.
Great, thank you. And you talked a little bit about sci-fi and fantasy and how there are some, say, tropes that are a bit difficult to have to encounter, and it's frustrating. There are also several horror tropes that exist in media, like you can't escape them. And men really only encounter them, let's say, when they're watching these movies or reading these stories, whereas women, it's something that is really a part of our daily lives. You talk about body horror, stalking, murder, all of these things that for men, it's a form of entertainment, it's a form of escape. It's something that we deal with on a daily basis. It's something that you do have to consider when you walk out at night. How would you, I'm trying to think of a question here that kind of articulates my point. How do you kind of encounter this type of media or engage with this media, knowing that it is so popular and it's something that really makes women's reality seems to make these horror tropes quite trite? Because, again, when you're dealing with it every single day, seeing it on the big screen, it's like, come on, like, please. What I deal with on a daily basis is far worse, and I can't escape it. So how would you really kind of engage with that idea that this type of entertainment is so popular, and yet the people who are so entertained by it, they may not seem to make the connection that this is something that really half of humanity is dealing with every single day?
Yeah, for sure. I think horror films and horror media and people's connection with it, and also like its social function, right, is really complex, and I think works on a couple of different levels, which I don't want to. I don't feel like I should go into or could coherently go into now exactly, but I think that in general, it is a truism that this kind of saturation of violence in media as recreation and as amusement is part of a like mechanism that is embedded in the culture of sort of destroying empathy. And certainly men deriving entertainment from these films that are just these like torture pornography or about sexualized violence against women is doing the same kind of thing as pornography is, to destroy men's capacity for empathy towards women. I also, though, think that horror can be used in some interesting ways as a media form, because of, say, for example, like women's closeness to these experiences. The horror that permeates women's lives means that women can wield horror tropes in a way that kind of rehumanizes or enables new pathways into an empathetic relationship with those experiences for the viewer. So I think horror can do some really interesting things, but it can also, and more in the dominant culture space, it more plays the role of, similar to like a first-person shooter game. It gives, it inures men to violence, it destroys the capacity for empathy, it glorifies violence and war and the destruction of others as the basis for selfhood, right? For subjectivity.
Great, thanks. We have an interesting comment in the chat. You had mentioned Chernobyl, and there's not really a question here, but maybe you could kind of share any of your thoughts regarding it. You know, that show and then that instance in history, it really does demonstrate that even a nuclear disaster is easier on the earth than the everyday workings of civilization. Do you have any thoughts about that comment?
Yeah, I agree completely. And that is this documentary that I spoke of, The Radioactive Wolves of Chernobyl, it shows that so clearly, that it was just industrial civilization. It was this pocket of humans living here in this way that was more destructive to all of this wildlife than the nuclear reactor explosion, you know, which really should give us pause about the way that we are living. But then also shows that when we are not living the way that we are living, which we will not be ad infinitum, because this way of being is not sustainable, that the earth and wildlife and the natural reality will have the capacity to return.
Regenerate. You
regenerate.
The last chapter in your book, if I can just read the subtitles, because it rolls off the tongue, but you talk a lot about the powers of regeneration. So the last chapter of the book is called Resurrectionary Feminism: Revitalize, Reintegrate, Resensitize, Revolt. Can you talk about that last R, the revolt part? That's that militant compassion that leads us to action, that's that urgency, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Do you have anything specific? I mean, I think I have that at the end of this list because I think that revitalization will necessitate revolt, and will sort of lead to it inevitably, because it's impossible to be revitalized and to be revivified and really alive in and to this world without rising up against the systems of harm. And ultimately, revolt is my purpose. I want resistance. I want organized political resistance to man-made industrial civilization. I want it to end, because that is what is causing all of these devastations, and that is the root of the atrocity. So none of this stuff that makes us feel better is of much utility if it's not directed towards ending the destruction. So I think about, like, you can't heal if there's still if you're still being cut, right? And so revolt is addressing the cutter that is man.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, Thistle, that point that you just pulled out from Aurora's book, I think that it really spoke to, I think, a lot of readers, including myself, you know, those of us who are working in a certain space regarding climate change and energy. We're trying to really change how our world works. And something you hear a lot of discussion about is a paradigm shift. That is what's necessary really to move forward and to create a world that is sustainable and that is not really destroying itself. What do you think is necessary for that paradigm shift? It's something you kind of touched on a little bit in a different way in your book, and I'd be really interested to hear your take.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, I would really rigorously come down to the fundamentals of it. And for me, I think the paradigm shift is based in the breakdown of mind-body dualism and of opposition with and to the natural world. I don't think that there can be reforms of patriarchal industrial civilization that would save it. I think the paradigm shift is much more fundamental and foundational than a lot of us are ready to reckon with.
Well said. Thanks. Thistle, do you have any other questions?
I don't. I just wanted to thank Aurora and also thank our audience today for tuning in to another WLRN live stream. Aurora, do you have a few parting words?
Thank you, everyone, for spending this time with us, and I am really happy to be able to speak about the book. I hope that people will find it valuable, and please do reach out to me if you're interested in an ecofeminist reading list. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I'm just going to take a moment and say that, you know, you can get this book at Spinifex Press. You can order it. I am going to be reading it with some friends of mine. We're going to revitalize a little feminist study group. I encourage you all to do the same, and also to get in touch with your local libraries and ask them to have it, because it's a text that can move us to action, to those regenerative powers of nature that can move us forward in our resistance, in our organized resistance. As Aurora was saying, you know, let's get organized. We need to because the death grip is so serious at this point. The boot on our necks is killing us, literally. And so I hope you all get the book and discuss it with friends and family. And thank you so much for tuning in to another WLRN live stream. I'm Thistle Pedersen, signing off, and have a wonderful afternoon.